There's a ship, and its name is Friendship. Now you think that name means a peaceful journey, right? Well, not this time. This ship is about to become the stage for one of the most incredible fights for freedom you've ever heard of.
Okay, so picture this. The date is July 2nd, 1839. We're on a schooner off the coast of Cuba, and its name, ironically, is La Amistad. On board, there are 53 African captives, chained up below deck. They've been bought like cargo, and they're headed for the brutal life of a sugar plantation. But here's the thing you have to understand. These weren't people who were born into a life of bondage. No, they were kidnapped from their homes in Africa just a few weeks earlier. They remembered being free, and they were about to make a choice that they would rather die fighting than live one more day as slaves.
So who was behind this incredible act of defiance? The leader was a young Mende man named Sengbe Pieh, though you've probably heard of him as Cinqué. He was a rice farmer, he had a family, and he was absolutely not going to let his story end in chains.
I mean, their resourcefulness was just absolutely incredible. In the middle of the night, Cinqué manages to find a loose nail. Think about that, a single nail. With it, he picks his own lock, and then he goes and frees the others. They find a stash of sugarcane knives, not exactly weapons, but they would have to do. And then they just swarmed the deck. In this furious uprising, they seized control of the Amistad.
So they had one simple demand: sail us home, back to Africa. They spare the lives of their two Spanish captors, Ruiz and Montes, so they can navigate. Now, during the day, Montes would sail east, towards the sunrise. But every night, under the cover of total darkness, he'd secretly turn the ship around, zigzagging north and west, just hoping to land somewhere friendly to him. For 2 whole months, this crazy cat-and-mouse game plays out until the ship finally drifts to shore, not in Africa, but on Long Island, New York.
And this is where the entire story just pivots. It goes from this desperate fight for survival at sea to an all-out war in the courtroom. Because you see, the Amistad captives had one huge, crucial fact on their side. What happened to them was illegal from the very beginning. Now you gotta remember, slavery itself was still legal in places like Cuba and the southern US, but the international slave trade, the act of literally kidnapping people from Africa and bringing them across the ocean, that had been outlawed by treaty. This one fact made the 53 captives victims of a crime, not property.
Oh, and the slave traders? They knew this. They weren't dumb. So to get around the law, they faked a bunch of documents, claiming the Africans were Ladinos, slaves who were born in Cuba and could, legally be sold. It was all a lie, a total fabrication designed to turn free human beings into property. And this piece of fraud, it would become everything in the legal battle to come.
So, when the U.S. Navy finally stumbles upon the Amistad, the Africans are thrown in jail in Connecticut. And suddenly, this story just explodes. It becomes a national obsession, and it forces America to ask a question it had been trying really, really hard to ignore.
The whole country was asking this one huge, uncomfortable question. Were these men and women property that had rebelled, committing murder and piracy? Or were they human beings who had been kidnapped and were just exercising their natural right to fight for their own lives? The answer was going to have massive consequences. And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. On one side, you had the Spanish government, and they were backed by the U.S. president at the time, Martin Van Buren. Their argument was pretty simple. Hey, look at the documents. A treaty says we have to return Spanish property, so send them back. But on the other side, you had a group of American abolitionists who were screaming, those documents are a lie. These are free people who have a right to defend themselves.
But then, everything changed. A massive turning point. The abolitionists, they found a translator, someone who spoke Mende, the language Cinqué and the others spoke. And for the first time, the Africans could tell their own story, in their own words. And when Cinqué testified, wow, it was absolutely explosive. He described his life, his capture. He proved it was impossible for them to be Cuban-born. He wasn't just some defendant anymore. He was a living, breathing witness to his own humanity.
So January 1840 rolls around, and the court hands down a verdict that just stuns everyone. The judge rules that the captives had been illegally kidnapped and enslaved. They were not property. They were free people who had acted in self-defense. It was a huge victory. But the fight was far from over. President Van Buren's administration, facing a ton of political pressure, immediately appealed the decision.
Of course, the administration wasn't having it. They appealed, and that sent the case all the way to the top, to the United States Supreme Court. The abolitionists knew they needed a legal giant on their side.
So they turned to, well, a pretty unlikely champion, former President John Quincy Adams. Get this, he was 73 years old and he hadn't argued a court case in over 30 years. But he was so moved by their cause that he agreed to lead their defense. Just imagine that, a former president of the United States walking back into a courtroom to argue for the rights of kidnapped Africans.
For 2 straight days, Adams gave what has to be one of the most powerful arguments the court had ever heard. He didn't just get bogged down in treaties and property law. Nope, he went straight for the heart of what America was supposed to stand for. He literally held up the Declaration of Independence and basically asked the justices how they could even think about treating these human beings as property when their own country was founded on the idea that all men are created equal with a right to liberty.
And then, on March 9, 1841, the final verdict came down. By a vote of 7-1, the Supreme Court agreed with the lower court. The Amistad captives were free. It was a monumental victory for human rights.
But being declared free doesn't just magically erase everything that happened. The ordeal wasn't over. For the survivors, there was still a long, hard journey home. And their fight, well, it would leave behind a legacy that echoes to this day.
This fight, this nearly 2-year legal battle, it took a terrible toll. Of the 53 men, women, and children who first rose up on that ship, only 35 survived to see their homes in Africa again. 18 of them died while locked away in American jails, from disease and from the sheer trauma of it all.
But the impact of what they did? It was just immense. You can't overstate it. Legally, the case established that people had a right to fight back against being illegally enslaved. Politically, it was like a shot of adrenaline for the abolitionist movement. And culturally, Cinqué became this global icon, a symbol of resistance and the powerful, universal desire to be free.
At the end of the day, the story of the Amistad really makes you think, doesn't it? It's about a revolt on one ship, sure, but it's also about how the incredible courage of just a few people can hold up a mirror to an entire nation and challenge its conscience, exposing that giant, painful gap between its ideals of liberty and the brutal reality of its actions.